Welcome to this week's edition of It is Chaile Time, and today we're going to do an educational, and we'll be focusing on the difference between an employee and an independent contractor. You may find yourself to have an independent contractor agreement, and therefore you're not necessarily an employee of the company. Or you may have seen some consultants in the company. Maybe sometimes it's an IT consultant, a human resources consultant, or even a marketing consultant. So why are they there? What are the benefits of having an independent contractor? An employer may from time to time not necessarily have the required skill or intellectual properties when it comes to a certain field of operations, maybe like marketing or operations itself, or human resources or information technology, and they may then outsource that functionality to an independent contractor, maybe with the purpose of upskilling themselves, gaining that intellectual properties, or just gaining a competitive advantage in the marketplace. But it is quite concerning how often an employer will offer an individual an independent contractor agreement instead of an employment agreement. But it is quite concerning how often an employer will offer an individual with an independent contract instead of a contract of employment, and often do so out of ignorance or maybe some malicious intent, because you see, the legal complications are that labor laws only protect parties to an employment relationship. So if you, for instance, are dismissed or your contract is terminated and you want to go to the CCMA, one of the factors that have to be established is whether there was an existence of an employment relationship. Now, in essence, if you have an independent contractor agreement, labor law do not really protect you as far as dispute resolution is concerned. So you can't really go to the CCMA to complain that you were unfairly terminated if you were an independent contractor. But that's not necessarily always so, because you see, our dispute resolution system is basically found on substance over form. So even though you may have this piece of paper, this contract that says that you are an independent contractor, it's not to say that you really are. So what are the differences between an employee and an independent contractor? Because you see, if you do go to the CCMA for whatever kind of dispute within the jurisdiction of the CCMA, if you are an independent contractor, you will have to first prove that in essence, you were really an employee, and that the independent contract agreement was a disguise for employment relationship. So basically, an independent contractor, there is a contract of work or a contract of service. With other words, a company will get a person in to come and do a certain task. For instance, let's say a plumber. A plumber will come and fix the leaking tap. Once he's done, he's done. Whereby an employee will have an employment relationship. That's it. That in principle is an indefinite relationship if you are a permanent employee, and you are providing your employer with your indefinite services, and there's also a fiduciary duty between you and your employer. So section 200 capital A of the Labor Relations Act provides 7 factors that can better understand whether you are an employee or an independent contractor. So just let us look at those 7 factors quickly. And actually the presumption operates this way, that if you are found to be an employee in one of these 7 factors, it's presumed that you are actually an employee. So it is not to say necessarily just that because your employer gave you an independent contractor contract that you are actually an independent contractor. We will look at, as we said, substance over form. So the first thing is the manner in which the person works is subject to the control or direction of another person. That is of an employee. If you're an employee, you're under the control of another person. That person will say, you have to do your work in a certain way, give you KPIs, you will start at 8 o'clock in the morning, take your lunch at 12, you go home at 5. But with the independent contractor, the manner in which the independent contractor works is not subject to the control or direction of another person. How does it work? Basically, when you recruit an employee, you will tell the person you start at 8 o'clock and you leave at 5. Not with the independent contractor. The independent contractor in principle is on the same level of bargaining power with the employer. So the employer won't tell the independent contractor you start at 8. It will ask you we want you to start at 8. Is that fine and okay with you? And you may say, no, you're not so bit early, you're still sleeping. Let's start at 9 o'clock. The employer may say, that's a bit too late. Why don't we make it 8:30? And you will shake hands and agree. You see, the difference is this. With the employment relationship, there's a master-servant relationship. With a true independent contractor agreement, the terms and conditions of that contract is negotiated. You negotiate and come to some form of agreement. Now, a typical person like that, the independent contractor, also is not subject to the basic conditions of employment act. There's no sick leave, maternity leave, annual leave, and so forth. These are matters of negotiation. Typically, an independent contractor will tell the employer, listen, on such and such day, I'll be going on leave. You see, it's a matter of negotiation. The second factor is the person's, an employee now, the person's hours of work are subject to the control or direction of another person. So with the employee, the employer will say, you work 8 hours a day or 9 hours a day. With the independent contractor, they will say, listen, there's a certain task that you've been hired to do. Make sure you complete the task. How you do it, it's up to you. Whether you outsource that work even further to another person, that's up to you. Like the plumber, you will often find that it's not the owner of the business that come and do the work. It's normally staff that does it. You see, so with an employee, the employer will direct you how to do the work, but they don't direct the independent contractor how to do the work. They will leave that up to himself. So the hours of work are not controlled or directed by the employer if you are an independent contractor. Now with an employee, number 3, in the case of a person who works for an organization, the person forms part of that organization. The independent contractor does not necessarily form part of the organization. So if you have to ask other employees of the company, do you think Yanni, as an example, he forms part of the organization? They may say, well, yeah, he uses his own canteen, he's here every single day. When we have a staff function, he's always invited and he's always there. Your independent contractors won't typically form part of the organization and its events and functions because they're not really part of the organization. Number 5, and this is a very important aspect, the person is economically dependent on the other person for whom he or she works or renders services. That's for an employee. So if you're an employee, you are dependent on the income of your employer. You normally only have one source of income. With the independent contractor, you are not economically dependent on that one organization. That means you are free to have multiple sources of income. You have other business interests, other service interests. But here's the thing. Often a true independent contractor will be recruited to work for a certain company. They are free in terms of their service level agreement or their contract to obtain additional sources of income, but they don't necessarily do so. So just the fact that you don't do so doesn't necessarily mean that you are not an independent contractor, because your marketing and sales initiatives is still up to you. But in principle, in terms of that contractual relationship, you will be free to source additional avenues of income for yourself. And this is the thing. When you are in an employment relationship, there's typically like a restraint of trade, which you won't necessarily find with the independent contractor, because that's the whole point. Myself as a labor law service provider, you know, for some businesses I am an independent contractor, but they can't lock me out and say I can't now freely trade or practice my profession. That's the whole point. So for some of the companies I do work for, I'm in a way also their competitor. You see, so, but they can't say, I can now no longer operate my business. Unless if they employ me, obviously. The person who is an employee worked for the employer for an average of at least 40 hours per month. So basically this person will do a lot of work for this one company, which is typically a sign that, there's maybe an employment relationship here. And that is not typically so for an independent contractor. And then, very important, with an employee, the employee is provided with the tools of trade and the equipment. So if you are working at a company, let's say an accountant or HR manager or so forth, they will typically provide you with the office, the desk, the laptop, the Wi-Fi, the phone, the car, and the petrol, and so forth. Independent contractor, there's normally a service or a management fee, and that independent contractor will provide his own tools of trade. That is quite important to understand, one of the big differences between the two. And then lastly, employee only renders for work to that one person or one company, whereby independent contractor generally provides services to more than one person or company at a time. So that's basically the difference. So you can now assess, if you're an employer, your independent contractors, sometimes you've started off with this idea that these people are legitimate independent contractors. But over time, they merged with the workforce and they really became employees. Go back to the drawing board and ask yourself, what is the objective and the purpose of these individuals? Are they still there on a temporary basis? Are they really there just to impart a certain skill or to complete a certain task? Or do you actually need them as employees, and maybe review your relationship you have with them? Because just the fact that you have an independent contract agreement with them is not to say that they are not protected, even though in principle they are not protected by labor laws. But if it can be shown in terms of this presumption of employment that they are actually an employee, well, then they will be protected. And you know, there's a test that the commissioner at the CCMA will use. It's actually called the dominant impression test. That means they will look at the contract, or the lack thereof. They will look at how this relationship practically looks like in the workplace, and whatever the dominant impression is, they'll make a ruling based on that. So if you have an independent contractor contract with somebody, but practically there's a master and servant relationship here, you know, there are terms and conditions as per the Basic Conditions of Employment Act that is operating within this relationship. Don't be surprised if there's a ruling coming out to say this person is actually an employee, because then as an employer you may be found wanting. And if you're an employee, if you are an independent contractor, a legitimate one, then you do know that, you know, labor laws will not cover you, will not protect you in terms of dispute resolution. But don't always just think that because you have a piece of paper that say you are an independent contractor that it is so, because sometimes employers do take a bit of advantage here. They will employ you on an independent contractor. They will say you don't get a salary, but you must submit the invoice at the end of the month. You know, they've heard this invoice thing, you know. If you ask somebody to submit the invoice, therefore he's no longer an employee. It's not necessarily so. You can still apply your mind in terms of this presumption in section 200 capital A of the Labor Relations Act. Are you an employee or are you an independent contractor? But for the employers, an independent contractor is often a viable way of upskilling your workforce, get some valuable IP in your company, and that can indeed give you a strategic advantage over your competitors without necessarily engaging in employment relationships. That's for this week. Employee versus an independent contractor. It can work for you as an employer. It can even work for you as an employee. Just a last step here before I go. Sometimes employers need to restructure their business and implement staff redundancies. As an alternative to employment, the independent contractor agreement can work for you as an employee. That's the one opportunity whereby you can actually start your own business you wanted to do for so a long period. Okay, maybe look into this. Become an independent contractor and get your old employer to be your first customer. You'll be surprised what new heights you can achieve. That's for this week. I hope you enjoyed this session of this Chaile Time. It's a bit of an occasional. See you next week again. Bye bye.